I was slicing tomatoes for the evening service when my phone lit up with a text from my youngest grandson, Marcus, the only one who still called me Nana instead of whatever they'd been plotting behind my back. The message was simple, but urgent. Nana, don't sign anything tonight, please. My hands paused mid-slice, the knife hovering over the cutting board in my restaurant kitchen, the place I'd built from absolutely nothing 42 years ago. I wiped my hands on my apron, the same navy blue one with golden stitching that read Eleanor's Table Est 1983, and stared at those 5 words until they blurred. Don't sign anything tonight. What did my 16-year-old grandson know that I didn't? What were they planning now? The afternoon light filtered through the kitchen windows of Eleanor's Table, my cornerstone restaurant in downtown Philadelphia, the first of what had become a collection of 6 establishments across 3 states, each one more successful than the last, each one built with my recipes, my management, my 67 years of learning what people truly wanted when they sat down to eat. Not just food, but comfort. Not just service, but family. The irony of that word not lost on me now. I'd started this restaurant when my children were small, when their father walked out and left me with 2 babies, a high school education, and a grandmother's cookbook filled with recipes that could make anyone feel loved. I'd worked double shifts as a waitress, saved every tip, learned bookkeeping from library books at night after my babies were asleep, and finally scraped together enough for a tiny storefront on a struggling street corner that everyone said would never amount to anything. They were wrong. I made it amount to everything. 42 years later, Eleanor's Table wasn't just a restaurant, it was an institution, a place where proposals happened, where families celebrated, where strangers became friends over my famous peach cobbler and slow-cooked short ribs that fell off the bone before the fork even touched them. The original location had expanded twice, taking over the neighboring buildings, adding a full bar, a private dining room, and a catering division that served events across the tri-state area. Then came Eleanor's Garden in Cherry Hill, Eleanor's Harbor in Atlantic City, Eleanor's Station in Baltimore, Eleanor's Corner in Pittsburgh, and just last year, Eleanor's Loft in Washington, D.C. Each one profitable, each one managed by people I'd trained personally, each one a testament to what happens when you refuse to let life tell you what you can't do. My children, Robert and Patricia, had watched all of this happen. They'd grown up in restaurant booths doing homework while I counted receipts. They'd complained about smelling like fried chicken at school. They'd rolled their eyes when I missed recitals because of catering emergencies. And now they wanted what I'd built, but they didn't want to earn it. They wanted to take it. Marcus's text made sense now as I remembered the family dinner invitation that had arrived last week, a formal printed card, which should have been my first warning because my family never did anything formal unless they wanted something. Announcing a celebration dinner at Robert's house in the suburbs, the McMansion he'd purchased 3 years ago, with money he'd borrowed from me and never fully repaid, despite promising he would, despite my keeping careful records in the same ledger system I'd used since 1983. Celebration of what? The invitation didn't say, just requested my presence at 6 o'clock sharp this coming Saturday, business casual attire suggested. Which was odd because since when did my own children tell me how to dress for family dinner? And at the bottom, in smaller print, almost an afterthought, Attorney Andrew Mitchell will be present to discuss important family matters. Please arrive promptly. An attorney at family dinner. Important family matters. Don't sign anything tonight. The pieces were arranging themselves into a picture I didn't like. Not one bit. I called my own attorney, James Crawford, the same man who'd helped me structure my business empire, who'd protected me through expansion deals and partnership negotiations, who'd become more than just my lawyer, but a trusted friend over 25 years of working together. James, I need you to tell me something honestly. If someone wanted to take my businesses from me, how would they do it? There was a pause, the kind of pause that meant he was choosing his words carefully, which meant my instinct was correct, which meant I was right to be worried. Eleanor, has something happened? My son invited me to dinner with his attorney present. He says it's about important family matters. Another pause. Longer this time. Don't go alone. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. I can be there. What time? 6 o'clock Saturday at Robert's house in Meadowbrook Estates. I'll be there at 5:45, he said. Eleanor, I want you to start thinking about something. If they're bringing an attorney to a family dinner, they've been planning this for a while. They're going to present something that sounds reasonable, sounds like they're helping you, sounds like they care. Don't believe any of it. Not one word. Saturday arrived with that peculiar feeling you get when you know something bad is coming, but you don't know the exact shape of it yet, like watching storm clouds gather and waiting for the first crack of thunder. I dressed carefully, not in business casual like the invitation suggested, but in what I always wore, a dignified navy dress with a string of pearls my grandmother left me, the same pearls I'd worn on opening night of the original Eleanor's table. The same pearls I'd worn when I signed the deed for each additional location, armor disguised as jewelry. James picked me up at 5:30, his silver sedan quiet and comfortable, his presence reassuring in a way that made me realize how alone I'd been feeling lately, how my children's phone calls had become less frequent, how their visits always seemed to involve requests for money, never just conversation, never just checking on their mother who'd given them everything. We drove through the tree-lined streets of Meadowbrook Estates, past houses that all looked the same, perfectly manicured lawns and two-car garages, and the kind of manufactured respectability that came from loans and credit, not actual wealth, not the kind of wealth that came from building something real with your own hands. Robert's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a colonial-style structure with white columns that were trying too hard to look impressive, and I could see cars already parked in the driveway. My daughter Patricia's silver SUV, another car I didn't recognize, probably the attorney, and lights blazing from every window, even though it was still daylight, as if they were staging something, as if they wanted witnesses to whatever they had planned. James parked on the street and turned to me before we got out. "Eleanor, remember, you're not obligated to respond to anything tonight. You can listen. You can say you need time to think. You can leave at any moment. I'm here as your attorney and your friend. Whatever they say, whatever documents they show you, we review everything before you even consider it. Do you understand?" I nodded, but my hands were shaking slightly as I reached for the door handle, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden clear understanding that my own children, the babies I'd raised alone, the teenagers I'd put through college by working 80-hour weeks, the adults I'd lent money to for houses and cars and business ventures that never quite worked out, were about to try to take everything from me. The front door opened before we could knock, and there was Robert, my 44-year-old son, tall and handsome in that easy way some men have when life hasn't been too hard on them, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, his smile warm and welcoming and completely fake, the smile he used with customers at the luxury car dealership where he worked, the smile that said, "Trust me," while his eyes calculated how much he could get from you. "Mom, you made it, and you brought James. How thoughtful." Though there was something in his voice that suggested my bringing my attorney wasn't thoughtful at all, but rather an inconvenience to whatever script they'd prepared. We walked into a living room that looked like it had been decorated by someone trying to impress people they didn't actually like. Everything matching, everything expensive, everything cold. And sitting on the leather sectional were my daughter Patricia, her husband Tom, whom I'd never particularly trusted, Robert's wife Jennifer, who'd always looked at my success with barely concealed resentment, and a man in his 50s, wearing a suit, who stood up and extended his hand with practiced professionalism. "Andrew Mitchell, family estate attorney. So pleased to meet you, Mrs. Washington. I've heard so much about your remarkable career. If you've ever walked into a room and immediately felt the air change, felt that electric sense that everyone present has been talking about you seconds before you arrived, felt your name still hanging in the air like smoke, you'll understand what happened next." My daughter Patricia stood up, her expression concerned in that exaggerated way people use when they're performing concern rather than feeling it, and gestured to an armchair that had clearly been designated as my spot, positioned so everyone could see me, so I was surrounded, so I was outnumbered. "Mom, please sit down. We have some things we need to discuss, important things, things that can't wait any longer." James positioned himself slightly behind my chair, his briefcase in hand, his presence a reminder that I wasn't alone, even though I felt profoundly alone in that moment, alone in the way you can only feel when your own children are the ones you need protection from. Robert cleared his throat, glanced at the attorney who gave him an encouraging nod, then looked at me with what I recognized as rehearsed sincerity, The same expression he'd used at age 12 when he'd been caught stealing from my purse and tried to convince me he'd just been borrowing it. Mom, we love you. We want you to know that everything we're about to discuss comes from a place of deep love and concern. And I felt my spine straighten because that phrase, deep love and concern, was what people said right before they did something terrible and wanted you to believe it was for your own good. We've been watching you lately, Robert continued, and we're worried, really worried, about your ability to handle the restaurants, all 6 of them, at your age, with your health concerns. My health concerns. I'd never felt better in my life. I walked 3 miles every morning. I worked 6 days a week. I just had my annual physical, and my doctor said I had the vitality of someone 20 years younger. But apparently my children had invented health concerns that didn't exist. Patricia jumped in, her voice gentle in that condescending way that made my teeth clench. Mom, you're 67 years old. You should be retiring, enjoying life, traveling, relaxing, not working these crazy hours, trying to manage a restaurant empire that's honestly become too much for one person. And I wanted to ask her when she'd last worked more than 30 hours a week at her part-time administrative job, when she'd last built anything, when she'd last done more than complain about how expensive everything was while driving a car I'd help finance. The attorney, Mitchell, leaned forward, his voice smooth and reasonable, the voice of someone who'd done this before, who specialized in convincing elderly people that giving up control was somehow empowering. Mrs. Washington, your children have asked me here tonight to present a solution that protects everyone, protects you from the stress of managing your businesses, protects your children's inheritance, protects the legacy you've built. And he said that word, inheritance, as if I were already dead, as if my life's work existed only as something to be divided after I was gone. He pulled out a folder, and I watched as he laid documents on the coffee table between us, official-looking papers with legal headers and dense paragraphs and signature lines highlighted in yellow. So many signature lines, and I felt James's hand touch my shoulder lightly, a reminder, don't sign anything. Not one page, not one line. Mitchell continued, his presentation polished and practiced. What we're proposing is a conservatorship arrangement. A structure where your children would assume legal control of your business assets and personal finances, ensuring professional management while you transition into a well-deserved retirement. You'd retain an allowance for personal expenses, of course. Generous, more than enough for your needs, and you'd have visitation rights at the restaurants. You could still eat there, still enjoy them. But the day-to-day operations, the financial decisions, the burden of ownership, all of that would transfer to Robert and Patricia, who are ready and eager to preserve your legacy. The words hung in the air like poison, each one carefully chosen, each one designed to sound caring while actually meaning control, management while actually meaning theft, transition while actually meaning erasure. I looked at my children, really looked at them, and saw strangers wearing familiar faces, saw people who'd decided their mother was an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Saw the same dismissive expression I'd seen on so many people's faces over the years when I was just a single mother with big dreams and no formal education. People who thought I couldn't possibly succeed. People who were wrong. James spoke before I could, his voice cutting through the manufactured concern with professional precision. This is a guardianship petition disguised as estate planning, he said flatly. Mrs. Washington is of sound mind, in excellent health, and managing a highly successful business portfolio. There's no legal basis for any conservatorship arrangement. You're asking her to voluntarily surrender control of assets she built and owns outright. Robert's friendly expression cracked slightly, showing irritation underneath. James, with all due respect, this is a family matter, and I think families should discuss family matters privately. You're not family. You're my attorney, I said, finding my voice, and right now, I need my attorney more than I need whatever this is. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, the same manipulative tears she'd used since childhood when she wanted something. Mom, we're trying to help you. Can't you see that? You're getting older. You're forgetting things. You nearly burned yourself last week at the restaurant, remember? And I stopped her right there, because I remembered exactly what she was talking about. A minor incident where I'd been teaching a new line cook proper searing technique, and he'd left a towel too close to the burner. Nothing to do with my competence, nothing to do with age, But they'd apparently taken that story and twisted it into evidence of my declining abilities. I stood up, and everyone in the room seemed surprised, as if they'd expected me to stay seated and overwhelmed, as if they'd expected an old woman who would fold under pressure. But I wasn't just an old woman. I was Eleanor Washington, and I'd faced down meaner people than my own spoiled children. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You invited me here under false pretenses. You brought an attorney without telling me this was a legal ambush. You've invented health concerns I don't have. You've twisted ordinary incidents into evidence of incompetence. And you want me to sign away control of businesses I built over 42 years, so that you, neither of whom has ever successfully managed anything in your entire lives, can take over my restaurants and my finances and give me an allowance like I'm a child. Did I miss anything?" The room was silent, except for the ticking of an expensive clock on the mantel, the kind of clock that cost more than it should because of a brand name, the same way everything in this house cost more than it should, the same way my children's lives cost more than they earned, which was exactly why they wanted my money, my businesses, my lifetime of work. Mitchell tried to recover his professional composure. "Mrs. Washington, I understand this is emotional. But if you just review the documents, you'd see this is actually quite favorable. You'd be protected, cared for, your children would handle everything," and James cut him off. "She's not signing anything. Not tonight. Not ever without proper independent review. And I'd advise you, counselor, that pursuing a guardianship petition against a competent adult with clear financial capacity could be considered elder abuse and potential fraud." Robert stood up, his face flushing red, the same way it had when he was a teenager and didn't get what he wanted. "This is ridiculous, Mom. We're trying to help you before you ruin everything, before you make mistakes, before the restaurants start failing because you're too old to run them properly. And you should be grateful we're willing to take this on. Do you know how much work it'll be to manage 6 restaurants? Do you know what we're offering to sacrifice for you?" "Nothing," I said quietly. "You're offering to sacrifice nothing. You want my restaurants. You want my money. You want what I built. And you thought I was old enough and stupid enough to just hand it over because you put it in legal language and called it love." Patricia grabbed her husband's arm, and I saw something in her expression shift from fake concern to real anger. "Fine, Mom, if that's how you want to be. We were trying to do this the easy way, the dignified way. But if you won't cooperate, if you won't see reason, there are other options, legal options, medical evaluations, competency hearings, and we have documentation, we have witnesses, we have months of evidence about your declining state, so maybe you should think very carefully about whether you want to do this the hard way." And there it was, the threat I'd been waiting for, the reveal of what this had always been about, not concern, but control, not love, but greed, not help, but theft disguised as family duty. James was already packing up, already moving toward the door, already making it clear we were leaving. But I stood there for another moment looking at my children, these people I'd raised and sacrificed for and loved despite everything. And I realized with sudden crushing clarity that they'd never seen me as strong, never seen me as capable, never seen me as anything but a resource to be exploited when useful and set aside when not. "You want a war?" I said, and my voice was harder than I'd ever heard it. Harder than 42 years of business negotiations, harder than the day I'd kicked their father out, harder than anything I'd ever had to do. "You just declared one. James, we're leaving." We walked out of that house into the cooling evening air, and I didn't look back, even though I could hear Patricia crying and Robert shouting something about how I'd regret this, how they were just trying to help, how I was making a terrible mistake. In the car, James was already making phone calls, talking to someone about protective orders and documentation, talking about the legal strategy we'd need, talking about how we'd fight this. But all I could think about was Marcus's text, my 16-year-old grandson, who'd somehow known, who'd somehow tried to warn me, who'd seen what his parents and aunt were planning, and had the courage to reach out, even though it meant betraying his own father. I called him from James's car while we drove back to my house, the house I'd bought and paid for, the house where I still lived alone and independent and capable despite what my children were trying to claim. Marcus answered on the first ring, his voice worried and young and so much more decent than the adults who'd raised him. "Nana, did you sign anything?" "No, baby, I didn't sign anything." and I need you to tell me everything you know." What I learned in the next 20 minutes as Marcus talked, his words spilling out in a rush of teenage honesty and fear, made my blood run cold in a way that the dinner confrontation hadn't. My children had been planning this for 6 months. They'd been collecting incidents, taking photos, recording conversations, building a case that I was declining mentally and physically. They'd been meeting with the attorney regularly. They'd already drafted plans for what they'd do with each restaurant once they had control. Robert wanted to sell Eleanor's table, the original location, the cornerstone of everything, because the land value had increased and developers were interested. Patricia wanted to convert Eleanor's garden into an event space and eliminate the daily restaurant service because it was too much work. They talked about putting me in a facility. A nice one, they'd said, expensive, but still a facility, somewhere they could visit occasionally and tell people they were taking such good care of their elderly mother. And Marcus, sweet Marcus, had overheard all of this during a family meeting he wasn't supposed to attend, had realized what his father and aunt were planning, had the decency to be horrified by it, and had tried to warn me the only way he knew how, through a text message that had potentially saved everything I'd built. I listened to my grandson describe how casually his parents had discussed dismantling my life's work, how they'd laughed about how easy it would be to convince a judge that a 67-year-old woman couldn't possibly manage 6 restaurants, how they'd already calculated the value of my businesses and divided them up between themselves, and I felt something inside me that had maybe been damaged by their dinner ambush suddenly crystallize into something harder, clearer, more dangerous than they'd anticipated. They thought I was weak. They thought I was old. They thought I was finished. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. And by the time I was done protecting what was mine, they'd learn exactly what happens when you underestimate Eleanor Washington. James pulled into my driveway, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing flashy, nothing extravagant, because I'd never needed to prove anything to anyone through possessions, only through work and results and the undeniable success of businesses that bore my name. He turned to me with an expression that was part concern and part something else, something that looked almost like pride. "Eleanor, what they tried tonight wasn't just inappropriate, it was potentially criminal, and we're going to make sure they understand that. But I need you to be prepared for what comes next, because they're not going to stop. They've invested too much in this plan, and people don't walk away from plans like this without a fight." "I know," I said, and I heard my own voice, sounding different than it had at the start of this evening, sounding like the voice I'd used 42 years ago when I'd signed the lease on a tiny restaurant space that everyone said would fail, sounding like the voice I'd used every time someone told me I couldn't do something, sounding like the voice of a woman who'd built an empire and would burn the whole world down before she let anyone take it from her. They want a fight. They're going to get one. But James, I need you to do something for me first thing Monday morning, something they won't expect, something that'll show them exactly how serious I am about protecting what's mine. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after sleepless nights spent planning battle strategies, and I was at James's office by 7:30, before most of the city was even awake, before my children could make their next move, before whatever legal machinery they'd set in motion could grind forward another inch. James had his entire conference table covered with documents, my business records, property deeds, corporate structures, partnership agreements, everything that proved beyond any doubt that I was not just competent, but exceptional at managing my empire. "We need to go on offense," he said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, his eyes red-rimmed from what I suspected was his own sleepless night reviewing my case. "They're expecting you to be defensive, to react, to scramble. Instead, we're going to show them exactly what happens when someone tries to steal from a woman who's been underestimated her entire life and use that underestimation as a weapon." The first thing we did was file for a restraining order against Robert and Patricia, citing their attempted coercion and threats of false medical claims, documenting everything from Saturday night's ambush, including the recordings Marcus had secretly made on his phone during his parents' planning meetings. Recordings he'd sent me Sunday night with a message that said, "Nana, I'm sorry they're doing this to you. Please use this to protect yourself. I love you." Those recordings were damning, absolutely damning. My son's voice casual and cold, discussing how they'd pay a doctor to evaluate me and find signs of dementia that didn't exist. My daughter laughing about how they'd already picked out which facility they'd place me in. both of them calculating the sale prices of my restaurants like they were dividing up garage sale items instead of businesses I'd built with 4 decades of blood and sweat and tears. The second thing James did was send cease and desist letters to Attorney Mitchell, warning him that any further contact regarding guardianship or conservatorship would be considered harassment and potential collusion in elder abuse. The third thing, the thing I'd asked for specifically, was to restructure my business holdings in a way that would make it legally impossible for anyone to take them from me, even if they somehow succeeded in having me declared incompetent, which they wouldn't. But I'd learned long ago that you don't wait for disaster to strike. You prevent it before it can. By noon on Monday, my children knew they'd made a catastrophic mistake because the restraining order was served to both of them at their homes, and their attorney received his cease and desist letter, and my phone started ringing with calls I didn't answer, messages I didn't listen to, texts that piled up unread because I had nothing to say to people who tried to steal my life. James's phone, however, did ring, and it was Mitchell calling, his smooth professional voice considerably less smooth now, suggesting perhaps there'd been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we could all meet again and discuss this reasonably. Perhaps Mrs. Washington had overreacted to what was simply a concerned family's attempt to help. James's response was brief and brutal. Your clients attempted to coerce my client into signing away her assets through manufactured claims of incompetence. We have recordings of them planning to falsify medical documentation. If they attempt any further contact or legal action, we'll pursue criminal charges for attempted fraud and elder abuse. This conversation is over. Wednesday afternoon, I was at Eleanor's table reviewing quarterly reports with my general manager, Maria Santos, a brilliant woman I'd promoted from line cook to manager over 15 years, someone who understood my vision, who'd helped expand our catering division, who'd been more loyal to me than my own blood. When my daughter Patricia walked in without warning, without permission, her face blotchy from crying, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like armor. Mom, please, we need to talk. You can't do this to us. The restraining order, people are talking, my friends are asking questions. You're humiliating us over a misunderstanding. I looked at her standing in my restaurant, the restaurant I'd built while she was a baby sleeping in a carrier next to the cash register, the restaurant where she'd taken her first steps between tables while I worked doubles, the restaurant she now wanted to see torn down and sold, and I felt something that might have been love once, but now was just exhausted disappointment. Patricia, you're in violation of a restraining order. Maria, please call the police. The color drained from Patricia's face as Maria reached for the phone without hesitation, as other staff members stopped what they were doing to watch, as my daughter realized that I meant every word, that there would be no negotiation, no forgiveness, no pretending this was just a family squabble that could be smoothed over with apologies and excuses. You wouldn't, Patricia breathed. But I already had, and within 8 minutes 2 police officers arrived and escorted my daughter out of my restaurant while she screamed about how cruel I was, how I'd turned against my own children, how she'd only been trying to help me. Help me. Those words she kept repeating as if saying them enough times would make them true. The officers were professional and kind, and one of them, a woman in her 40s, paused before leaving and said quietly, "Ma'am, my mother went through something similar with my brother. He tried to get power of attorney when she was perfectly fine, just wanted her house. I'm glad you're fighting back. I'm glad you're not letting them do this to you." After they left, I stood in my restaurant surrounded by staff who'd witnessed the whole scene, and I made a decision I probably should have made years ago. I called an all-staff meeting across all 6 locations for Thursday evening, after regular service hours, mandatory attendance, and I told them everything. Not just about the attempted theft by my children, but about the future of the restaurants, about succession planning, about the loyalty program I was implementing that would give long-term employees equity shares, about the management training program that would identify future leaders from within our ranks, about my intention to ensure that Eleanor's table and all its sister locations would continue long after I was gone, but not in the hands of my children. Never in the hands of people who saw my work as nothing more than assets to liquidate. If you've been following this story and you have your own experience with family betrayal, I need you to know you're not alone, and I hope you'll share your story in the comments because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to stay silent about the people who try to take what we've earned. The meeting Thursday night was one of the most emotional experiences of my professional life, standing in the main dining room of the original Eleanor's table, surrounded by more than 70 employees, some who'd been with me for 20 years, some who'd just started, all of them listening as I explained what was happening, as I showed them the legal documents my children had tried to make me sign, as I told them my plan to protect not just my ownership, but their jobs, their futures, their stake in businesses they'd helped build. A sous chef named Raymond, who'd worked for me for 18 years, stood up with tears in his eyes and said, "Miss Eleanor, you gave me a chance when I was fresh out of prison and nobody else would hire me. You taught me everything I know. You treated me like family when my own family had given up on me, and I just want you to know that every single person in this room will fight for you the same way you fought for us." The applause that followed wasn't polite or obligatory. It was thunderous. It was real. It was the sound of people who understood loyalty not as a word, but as a choice you make every day. And I understood in that moment that I'd built something more valuable than real estate or revenue. I'd built a family that actually functioned like families should, and my children's attempt to destroy that had only made it stronger. But that same night, after the meeting, after the hugs and promises and renewed commitment from my staff, I came home to find my house had been broken into, not violently, no smashed windows or kicked-in doors, but someone had used a key, my key, the spare key I'd given Patricia years ago for emergencies, and they'd gone through my personal files, my bedroom, my home office, taking photos I realized when I found her phone propped up recording in my bathroom, a phone that was still on, still recording, that had captured hours of footage of my empty house, footage they planned to use as evidence of what I couldn't imagine, maybe that I was messy, maybe that I was disorganized, maybe that the prescription bottles in my medicine cabinet meant I was unhealthy. Never mind that those prescriptions were just cholesterol medication and vitamin D supplements that half the population took. I called the police, I called James, and I stood in my violated home feeling something I hadn't felt during the restaurant ambush or even the legal threats. I felt afraid. Genuinely afraid, because people who would break into your house, who would violate your private space, who would record your bathroom for evidence, those weren't people who would stop at legal boundaries. Those were people who'd crossed a line into something desperate and dangerous. The police took the phone as evidence, and James immediately filed for criminal charges, breaking and entering, unlawful surveillance, harassment. And I sat in my kitchen at midnight with a locksmith changing every lock in my house while police officers took statements, and I thought about how far my children had fallen, how far I'd apparently failed as a mother, that I'd raised people capable of this, people who would commit crimes against their own mother to get money they hadn't earned. My phone rang, unknown number, and something told me to answer it even though I normally wouldn't. The voice on the other end was Robert's wife, Jennifer, and she was crying, real crying, not manipulative crying, and her words came out in a rush. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it would go this far. I told Robert this was wrong from the beginning, but he wouldn't listen, and now he's talking about doing something worse, something I can't be part of. And I needed to warn you, because whatever happens next, I don't want you to think I was part of it. I don't want you to get hurt." "What is he planning?" I asked, my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's meeting with someone tomorrow, someone who evaluates people for commitment, someone who works at psychiatric facilities, and he's going to try to have you involuntarily committed. He says if he can get you held for 72 hours for evaluation, he can use that as evidence that you're incompetent. And Eleanor, he's not going to stop. He's borrowed money against the expectation of getting your businesses, serious money from serious people, and he's desperate." The line went dead, and I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by police officers and locksmiths and the debris of my violated privacy. And I understood with absolute clarity that my son wasn't just greedy, he was dangerous. He'd leveraged debts against assets he didn't own. He'd made promises he couldn't keep without stealing from me, and now he was trapped between his lies and reality. And trapped animals did desperate things. I called James even though it was nearly 1 in the morning. "They're going to try to have me committed," I said. "Tomorrow. Involuntary psychiatric hold. Can they do that?" There was silence on the line, the kind of silence that meant he was thinking through legal procedures, running through scenarios, calculating dangers. They'd need to convince a doctor you're a danger to yourself or others, he said finally. It's a high bar, but if they falsify information, if they claim you've made threats or shown violent behavior, if they can get you to a facility for evaluation, even if you're released after 72 hours, the damage is done, there's a record, and they'll use it in court. So what do? You disappear, he said. Tonight, pack a bag. I'll have someone pick you up in 20 minutes. We have a safe house, an apartment we use for clients in witness protection situations. Nothing fancy but secure, and you stay there until we can get ahead of this legally, until we can expose what they're planning before they can execute it. This is really happening, I said, and it wasn't a question. It was just the stunned realization that I was 67 years old and going into hiding from my own children like a fugitive. 25 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up driven by a woman named Sandra who worked security for James's firm, and I threw a hastily packed suitcase in the trunk and took one last look at my house, the house I'd lived in for 32 years, the house where I'd raised my children and celebrated holidays and built my businesses from the kitchen table, and I wondered if I'd ever feel safe there again, if my children had destroyed not just our relationship, but the sense of home I'd worked so hard to create. The safe house was a corporate apartment downtown, sterile and anonymous, the kind of place that existed purely for function without any personality, and I spent that night lying awake on unfamiliar sheets in an unfamiliar bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds, thinking about how my life had transformed from successful business owner to hunted prey in less than a week. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Nana, where are you? Dad is freaking out. He went to your house and you're not there. He's calling everyone. Please tell me you're okay." I texted back. "I'm safe. Don't tell anyone. I'll explain later. Trust me." His response came immediately. "I trust you. I love you. Be careful." Friday morning, James arrived at the safe house with coffee and a stack of legal documents and the expression on his face that made my stomach drop even before he spoke. "Eleanor, we have a problem, a serious problem. Your son filed emergency guardianship papers this morning, claiming you've disappeared, claiming this proves you're mentally unstable and need immediate intervention, and he's got 2 affidavits from people claiming they've witnessed your declining state." "2 affidavits from who?" I demanded. "One from your daughter Patricia, describing incidents of confusion and memory loss, none of which are true, but she's documented them in detail, dates and times and specific examples, completely fabricated, but convincing if you don't know they're lies. And the second is from your former business partner, Leonard Green." Leonard. I hadn't heard that name in 15 years, not since I'd bought him out of the original Eleanor's table when his gambling debts had nearly destroyed the business we'd started together. Not since I'd paid him a generous settlement to walk away and never contact me again. Not since he'd told mutual friends I'd stolen his dream and his restaurant and his future. Leonard Green, who'd always been bitter about my success, who'd apparently been waiting 15 years for an opportunity to hurt me, had signed an affidavit claiming I'd shown signs of mental decline even back then, claiming he'd been concerned about my decision-making, claiming he'd tried to protect the business from my erratic behavior. Every word a lie, every word designed to support my children's claim that I was incompetent. James continued, his voice grim. "The hearing is scheduled for Monday morning emergency session, and if the judge grants even temporary guardianship, your children get immediate control of your finances and businesses. And Eleanor, I have to be honest with you. They've built a compelling case on paper. They have family members claiming concern. They have a former business associate supporting their claims. They have documentation of incidents. And they're going to argue that your disappearance proves you're not thinking clearly. Can we win?" "I can fight it," James said. "We have Marcus's recordings. We have evidence of their criminal behavior. We have your medical records showing perfect cognitive function. We have testimony from your staff and managers. But here's what concerns me. Judges in these cases tend to err on the side of caution. They'd rather grant temporary guardianship and sort it out later than risk leaving someone truly incompetent without protection. And your children know this. They're counting on it. They just need to get temporary control. And once they have it, once they can claim they're managing your affairs, it becomes much harder to prove they shouldn't be." I stood at the window of the safe house apartment, looking down at the city I'd conquered over 42 years, the city where I'd built an empire starting with nothing, The city where my restaurants fed thousands of people every week, where my name meant quality and consistency and the kind of success that came from never giving up. And I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. The betrayal, the legal battle, the realization that despite everything I'd achieved, I could lose it all. Because a judge might believe my children's lies over my truth. What are my options? I asked, not turning from the window, not wanting James to see how close I was to breaking. We fight in court on Monday, and we hope the judge sees through their fabrications, he said quietly. Or we take this public, we go to the media, we expose what they're trying to do before they can do it. We let public opinion pressure the court. But Eleanor, that's a nuclear option. That's your private family business becoming headline news. And once you do that, there's no taking it back. Your children will be publicly destroyed. Your family will be permanently fractured. And you'll be known forever as the woman whose children tried to steal her empire. And I couldn't tell from his voice whether he thought that was a good thing or a terrible thing. I turned from the window, and I looked at this attorney who'd become my friend, who'd stood by me through expansion and negotiation, and now this nightmare. And I thought about my grandmother, the woman whose pearl necklace I still wore, the woman who'd escaped sharecropping in Alabama and built a life in Philadelphia washing other people's clothes, the woman who'd taught me her recipes and her strength and her absolute refusal to let anyone tell her what she couldn't do. And I heard her voice, in my memory, saying what she'd said when I was a scared teenage mother with no prospects and no hope. Baby girl, they can take your money and your house and your dignity, but they can't take who you are unless you let them, so don't you ever let them. I made my decision, and I felt it settle into my bones with certainty. Call the media, I said. Every outlet, newspapers, television, radio, social media, all of it. I want them here by this afternoon. If my children want a fight, if they want to destroy me publicly with their lies, then I'll meet them in the public square, and we'll see whose story people believe, the successful businesswoman who built an empire, or the greedy children who want to steal it. Are you sure? James asked, and I heard the concern in his voice, heard him asking not as my attorney, but as my friend whether I truly wanted to open this wound for the world to see. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. By 4 o'clock Friday afternoon, my safe house apartment had become a media staging ground, with reporters from the Philadelphia Inquirer, local television stations, business publications, and even some national outlets who'd heard about the story and smelled blood. The kind of story that had everything: family drama, elder abuse, business empire, legal battles, the American dream turned nightmare. I sat in front of cameras and recording devices, still wearing my grandmother's pearls, and I told them everything, showed them everything, the documents my children had tried to make me sign, the recordings of their planning meetings courtesy of Marcus, the evidence of the break-in, the affidavits built on lies, the emergency guardianship filing designed to steal my life's work. I spoke clearly and calmly, the way I'd spoken to loan officers who doubted me, the way I'd spoken to suppliers who tried to cheat me, the way I'd spoken to every person who'd ever underestimated me. And I watched the reporters' expressions shift from professional interest to genuine shock to barely concealed anger on my behalf as they realized what my children had attempted. The story broke online by 6 o'clock, and by 8 it was trending on social media. And by 10 o'clock Friday night, my children's attempt to quietly steal my empire had become a national conversation about elder abuse, about family greed, about what happens when children see their parents not as people, but as assets to be harvested. My phone, which I'd turned back on, exploded with messages from friends I hadn't heard from in years, from customers of my restaurants expressing support, from complete strangers telling me their own stories of family betrayal, from business colleagues offering help, from Marcus sending a simple message, "Nana, you're so brave. I'm proud of you. Dad is losing his mind. The whole family is freaking out. But you did the right thing." But there were other messages too, from Robert, from Patricia, and these weren't apologetic or conciliatory. These were vicious, filled with rage and accusations, claiming I'd destroyed the family, claiming I'd humiliated them for no reason, claiming I'd lied to the media, claiming they'd never tried to steal anything but only wanted to help. And I realized something cold and terrible. They actually believed their own lies. They'd convinced themselves so thoroughly that they deserved my businesses, that my refusal to hand them over seemed like betrayal rather than self-preservation. Saturday morning, James called with news that made my momentary satisfaction evaporate instantly. "Eleanor, your son isn't backing down. He's accelerating. He filed an emergency motion claiming the media attention proves you're having a mental breakdown, claiming competent people don't air family business publicly, claiming this is evidence of impaired judgment, and he's got a doctor who's willing to sign off that going to the media indicates possible manic episode or delusional behavior. And the judge is actually considering it. We have a hearing tomorrow, Sunday, emergency session. And if this judge grants even temporary guardianship based on the media circus, everything we just did, all the public exposure, it backfires completely. It becomes evidence against you instead of evidence for you." "How is that possible?" I demanded. "How can defending myself publicly be used as proof I'm incompetent?" "Because the legal system doesn't care about fairness," James said flatly. "It cares about procedure and precedent. And there is precedent for judges being concerned when elderly individuals make dramatic public statements during family disputes. There's this paternalistic idea that stable, competent people handle things privately, and your son's attorney is exploiting that. And Eleanor, I need you to prepare yourself. Tomorrow's hearing could go very badly. We could walk out with your son as your temporary guardian, and once that happens, even if we overturn it later, the damage is done. He'll have access to your accounts, your businesses, everything, even if just for days." I sat in that safe house apartment Saturday afternoon, watching news coverage of my own life, seeing commentators debate whether I was a victim or whether this was a family matter that shouldn't have been publicized, seeing my children giving interviews I couldn't bear to watch, seeing my businesses being discussed as if they were already up for grabs, seeing my life dissected by strangers who'd never built anything, never risked anything, never understood what it meant to fight for every inch of ground you'd gained. And I felt something that might have been despair start to creep in. The terrible thought that maybe I'd made everything worse. Maybe going public had been exactly the wrong move. Maybe my children were going to win after all, not despite my fighting back, but because of it. My phone rang, unknown number again, and this time it was Robert's attorney, Andrew Mitchell. His voice smooth and professional again, offering me a deal, a settlement, suggesting perhaps we could avoid tomorrow's hearing if I'd just agree to a voluntary retirement advisory board, just some family oversight, nothing too invasive, just enough to show the court I was being reasonable, and in exchange they'd drop all the competency claims, all the guardianship petitions, all the legal actions. We could make this whole ugly situation disappear. And I almost considered it. Almost thought maybe compromise was better than risk. Almost thought maybe I should just give them some control to protect the rest. Almost let fear make my decisions instead of strength. But then I remembered something my grandmother had told me the night before she died. She'd taken my hand and said, "Baby girl, the moment you compromise with bullies is the moment you tell them bullying works, and they'll come back for more, always more, until there's nothing left of you to take. So if you're gonna fight, fight all the way, fight till they break, or you do. But don't you dare meet them halfway, because halfway is just where they'll stand when they take the second half." I told Mitchell no, told him to tell my son I'd see him in court Sunday morning, told him I'd rather lose everything fighting than keep anything through surrender, and I hung up before he could argue, before I could second-guess myself, before the fear could take root and grow into something that would destroy me faster than any legal battle. James arrived at the safe house Saturday night with a trial bag and a grim expression, and Marcus, my grandson Marcus, who'd apparently run away from his father's house and demanded James bring him to me, who wrapped his 16-year-old arms around me and said, "Nana, Dad doesn't know I'm here, but I'm testifying tomorrow. I'm telling the judge everything. I don't care if he never speaks to me again. You protected me my whole life, and now I'm protecting you." I held my grandson and felt tears I'd been holding back for days finally break through, and I thought about succession and legacy and what we leave behind, and I realized that maybe the real inheritance I was leaving wasn't buildings or businesses or money. Maybe it was this boy who understood loyalty and justice and standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. Maybe that was worth more than any empire. Sunday morning arrived with rain. The kind of cold October rain that feels like an omen, and we drove to the courthouse in James's car, Marcus beside me holding my hand. Both of us dressed formally like we were going to trial, because we were. We were going to trial for my freedom, for my businesses, for my right to control my own life at 67 years old, when I'd never been more competent, more capable, more deserving of autonomy. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more intimate, which somehow made it worse, made it feel more like a family intervention than a legal proceeding. And there were my children, Robert and Patricia, sitting with Attorney Mitchell. And when Patricia saw Marcus walk in with me, her face transformed into something ugly, something that looked like rage and betrayal. And she stood up and shouted across the courtroom, "How dare you bring my son into this? How dare you turn him against his own?" Father and the bailiff had to quiet her down while Robert stared at Marcus with an expression that made me glad there were security officers present, an expression that said Marcus would pay for this betrayal later. And I thought about how my son had learned violence, not through anything I'd taught him, but through his own entitled rage at not getting what he wanted. The judge entered, a woman in her 50s named Sandra Kowalski, and she looked at all of us with the exhausted expression of someone who'd seen too many family disputes turn toxic, too many cases where love had curdled into litigation. And she said before anyone could speak, "I've reviewed the filings, I've read the news coverage, I've seen the evidence from both sides, and I'm going to tell you all right now that this is one of the most disturbing cases I've encountered in 15 years on the bench. Disturbing not because of any alleged incompetence, but because of what it reveals about family dynamics when money is involved. And before we begin formal proceedings, I want to make something very clear. I don't care who's related to whom. I don't care about family loyalty or family drama. I care about the law and what's right. And if I find that anyone in this courtroom has filed false affidavits or made fraudulent claims or attempted to abuse the guardianship system for financial gain, I will not hesitate to refer the matter for criminal prosecution. So if anyone wants to withdraw their petitions or revise their statements, now would be the time." The courtroom was silent, and I watched Robert and Patricia exchange glances, watched Mitchell lean over to whisper something urgent. And for a moment, I thought maybe they'd back down. Maybe the judge's warning had penetrated their greed and desperation. Maybe this nightmare would end before it went any further. But then Robert stood up and said, "Your Honor, with respect, my mother's behavior over the past week proves exactly what we've been claiming. Competent people don't go to the media with family disputes. Competent people don't disappear into hiding. Competent people don't turn their own grandson against his father. And we believe temporary guardianship is necessary to protect not just her assets, but her well-being, while a proper evaluation can be conducted." Judge Kowalski's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went cold. "Sit down, Mr. Washington. You'll have your chance to present evidence. Attorney Park, I assume you're representing Mrs. Washington?" James stood, and I'd never seen him look more like a warrior heading into battle. "Yes, Your Honor. And we're prepared to demonstrate not just that Mrs. Washington is completely competent, but that this entire guardianship petition is a coordinated attempt at elder abuse and theft, and we have evidence including recorded conversations of the petitioners planning to fabricate medical claims, evidence of breaking and entering, evidence of fraud, and testimony from Mrs. Washington's grandson about the true nature of this family conflict." And that's when Patricia made the mistake that would change everything. She couldn't contain herself, couldn't stay silent, couldn't maintain the performance of the concerned daughter, and she stood up and screamed, "That little traitor has no right to testify. He's just a child. He doesn't understand what's really happening. Mother has manipulated him. She's turned him against his own family, and, Your Honor, if you let her grandson testify, you're just letting her continue to manipulate and control people, which is exactly what we're trying to stop." The judge's gavel came down hard, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot. "Ms. Washington, sit down and be quiet, or I will hold you in contempt. This court will hear from any witness deemed relevant, and your attempt to exclude testimony from your own son tells me more about your motivations than anything in these filings." But then Judge Kowalski looked at me, really looked at me, and said something I wasn't expecting. "Mrs. Washington, before we proceed, I need to ask you something directly. Have you been experiencing any confusion, any memory problems, any cognitive difficulties that you're aware of? Be honest with this court. The entire courtroom held its breath, and I realized this was the moment. This was where everything balanced, where one wrong word could destroy me, where the judge was giving me a chance to prove myself, but also testing whether I could do it under pressure. I stood up. James tried to stop me, but I needed to stand, needed to look this judge in the eye as an equal, needed to show her exactly who Eleanor Washington was. Your Honor, I'm 67 years old. I own and operate 6 successful restaurants across 3 states. I employ over 200 people. I've completed every cognitive and physical evaluation my doctors recommend. I manage complex financial portfolios and real estate holdings. I work 6 days a week, and last quarter my businesses generated their highest revenue in company history. I haven't experienced any confusion or memory loss or cognitive difficulties. What I've experienced is my children deciding they want what I've built, trying to manipulate me into giving it to them, and when that didn't work, trying to use the legal system to take it by force. I came forward publicly, not because I'm having a breakdown, but because I refuse to be quiet about elder abuse, because I refuse to let my children steal from me in the darkness, and because I believe sunshine is the best disinfectant for lies. If wanting to protect what I've earned makes me incompetent, then I guess every successful business owner in America should be declared incompetent, because we all fight to protect what's ours. The judge nodded slowly, and I saw something in her expression shift, saw her seeing me not as a case file, but as a person, as a woman who'd built something real and was defending it against predators who happened to share her DNA. Attorney Mitchell, she said, I'm going to give you one opportunity to present your evidence of incompetence. Actual evidence, not family concerns or suspicions, but documentation from qualified medical professionals who've actually evaluated Mrs. Washington recently, not 15 years ago, recently, showing cognitive decline. Do you have such evidence? Mitchell stood up, shuffled papers, exchanged glances with Robert and Patricia, and I watched him realize in real time that they'd built their case on lies and manipulation and the assumption that a judge would simply take concerned children at their word, that they'd never actually bothered to get real evidence because they'd never expected me to fight back, never expected me to expose them, never expected their own son and grandson to betray them. Your Honor, we have affidavits from family members documenting concerning incidents, and we believe, the judge interrupted him. I didn't ask what you believe. I asked for medical evidence. Do you have it or not? No, Your Honor, Mitchell admitted, but we're requesting the court order an evaluation, which is standard in these cases. It would be standard if there was any legitimate basis for concern, Judge Kowalski said, but I've seen nothing in these filings except evidence that Mrs. Washington's children want her money and are willing to abuse the guardianship system to get it. Attorney Park, present your evidence. What followed was 2 hours of James systematically destroying my children's case, playing the recordings Marcus had made of Robert and Patricia planning to fabricate medical evidence, showing the break-in police report and evidence they'd tried to gather illegally, presenting testimony from my doctors confirming my excellent health, testimony from my property managers and restaurant staff about my sharp business acumen, financial records showing not just competent management, but exceptional growth and profitability, and finally, Marcus took the stand and told the truth, told the whole truth, about everything he'd overheard, everything his father and aunt had planned, everything they'd said about me when they thought no one was listening. And I watched my son Robert try to maintain his composure while his own child testified against him, watched Patricia cry tears that might have been genuine this time, genuine grief not at losing money, but at losing her son's respect, watched Attorney Mitchell realize his clients had made him complicit in something potentially criminal, watched the courtroom audience, yes, there was an audience, reporters and concerned citizens who'd followed the story, watched them react with horror and anger at what my children had attempted. When Marcus finished testifying, when he stepped down from the witness stand and walked past his father without looking at him, walked directly to me and took my hand, Judge Kowalski leaned forward and said in a voice that carried through the silent courtroom, I've been a judge for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of ugly family situations, but this is exceptional in its cruelty and its calculation, Mr. Washington. Ms. Washington, you should be ashamed of yourselves. You attempted to weaponize the legal system against your own mother. You fabricated evidence. You broke into her home. You tried to manipulate the guardianship process for financial gain. and you involved your minor son in criminal conspiracy. I'm not just denying your guardianship petition. I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of elder abuse, attempted fraud, and perjury. Additionally, I'm granting Mrs. Washington's request for a permanent restraining order against both of you. You are to have no contact with your mother, no contact with her businesses, no presence on any property she owns, and if you violate this order, you will be arrested. This hearing is concluded. The gavel came down, and I should have felt relief, should have felt victory, should have felt vindication, but instead I felt something hollow and sad, felt the weight of what I'd lost even in winning, felt the permanent fracture of family bonds that should have been unbreakable, felt my children's hatred radiating across the courtroom like heat. And I wondered if this was what success looked like when it cost you everyone you'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. But then Marcus squeezed my hand, and James put his arm around my shoulders, and Maria from Eleanor's table, who'd come to testify and stayed for the verdict, came over and hugged me hard, and I realized that maybe family wasn't just blood. Maybe family was the people who stood beside you when blood turned against you. Maybe I'd lost children, but gained something more valuable, dignity and autonomy, and the right to live my own life on my own terms until the day I died. We left the courthouse through a crowd of reporters, and I made a brief statement, thanked the judge, thanked my legal team, thanked everyone who'd supported me, but I didn't mention my children, didn't say anything about forgiveness or reconciliation or hope for the future, because some breaks are permanent, some betrayals are unforgivable, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise for the cameras. Marcus came home with me that day, not to the safe house, but to my real house with its new locks and security system, and he called his mother Patricia and told her he was staying with me until he turned 18, that he'd testified against his father because his father was wrong, that he loved me more than he feared his parents' anger, and I listened to him have that conversation, heard Patricia screaming on the other end, screaming about lawyers and custody and parental rights. And Marcus just said calmly, "Mom, I'm 16. I'm old enough to choose where I live, and I choose Nana." And he hung up and looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "I'm sorry you lost your kids, but you didn't lose me. And Nana, you shouldn't have to be alone just because you refused to be a victim." That night, Sunday night, after the courthouse and the media and the police reports and the restraining orders, I sat in my living room with Marcus and James, and we ordered takeout from Eleanor's table, and we ate my restaurant's food in my house, and we talked about the future, about Marcus finishing high school, about college plans, about business succession, about my plan to create a foundation that would protect my restaurants and employees long after I was gone, about the employee equity program that would ensure the people who actually built my empire would share in its success, about everything I'd been planning before my children had tried to steal it all. And James said something that stayed with me. "Eleanor, you won today, but this isn't over. They're facing potential criminal charges. They're publicly humiliated. They're desperate and desperate angry people do desperate angry things. So I need you to promise me you'll stay vigilant. You'll maintain security. You'll trust your instincts, because people who tried once to take everything will try again. They just have to wait for the right moment." I promised, but I didn't really believe him. Didn't think my children would be stupid enough to try anything else after being so thoroughly defeated in court, after being exposed publicly, after losing their son and grandson. But I should have listened to James, should have trusted his experience with desperate people, should have remembered that shame and rage make terrible advisors, because 3 days later, on Wednesday evening, I was working late at the original Eleanor's table, reviewing inventory in the back office, when the fire alarms went off, when smoke started filling the restaurant, when I realized someone had started a fire in the storage room, and I heard the back door slam and saw a figure running away from my building, running from the fire they'd just set, and I stood there in the smoke and chaos thinking about everything I'd built over 42 years, thinking about how it could all burn down in minutes, thinking about my children and what they'd become. And I grabbed the fire extinguisher and ran toward the flames. The fire was smaller than I'd feared, but more deliberate than I'd imagined. Started with accelerant in the dry storage room where we kept linens and paper goods, materials chosen because they'd burn fast and spread quickly. Not the work of an opportunist, but someone who knew my building, knew where to strike for maximum damage, knew exactly what they were doing. I fought the flames with my extinguisher while Maria called 911 and evacuated the last few customers and staff. And by the time the fire department arrived, the blaze was mostly contained, but the damage was done, smoke and water and destruction in the heart of my first restaurant, the cornerstone of everything I'd built, and I stood in the parking lot wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, watching firefighters work, knowing with absolute certainty that my children had escalated from legal theft to actual arson, from manipulation to violence, from wanting what was mine to trying to destroy what they couldn't have. The fire marshal found the evidence within an hour: accelerant patterns, forced entry at the back door, security camera footage from a neighboring business showing a figure in dark clothing approaching my building at 9:45 and running away at 9:52. And when they showed me the footage, asked if I recognized anything about the person's build or movement or clothing, I felt my stomach twist because I did recognize something. Recognized the way they moved, recognized the jacket, recognized my son Robert because I'd bought him that jacket for Christmas 2 years ago, an expensive North Face parka he'd specifically requested, and now he'd worn it while burning down my restaurant. The police detective, a tired-looking man named Morrison, who'd seen too much of humanity's worst, sat with me in the front dining room that smelled like smoke and asked the question he already knew the answer to. Mrs. Washington, given your recent legal issues with your son, do you believe he could be responsible for this fire? And I heard myself say yes, heard myself cross a line I'd never thought I'd cross, accusing my own child of felony arson. But the truth was the truth, and protecting Robert from consequences hadn't worked when he was a teenager stealing from my purse, and it wouldn't work now that he was a middle-aged man burning down my building. They arrested Robert at 4 a.m. Thursday, pulled him from his bed in that McMansion I'd helped him buy, found the jacket in his garage with accelerant residue still on the sleeves, because apparently, in addition to being greedy, he was also stupid, found receipts for the accelerant purchased the day before from a hardware store where security cameras captured his face clearly, found text messages on his phone to Patricia that said, "If she won't give us the restaurants, there won't be any restaurants to give," found the complete smoking gun evidence of premeditated arson that would send him to prison for years. Patricia was arrested 6 hours later as an accessory and conspiracy to commit arson, and I watched the news coverage from my kitchen where Marcus sat beside me, his face pale and shocked, watching his father being led away in handcuffs, watching his mother screaming at reporters that they were innocent, that I'd framed them, that this was all part of my campaign to destroy the family, and I wanted to feel something, wanted to feel vindicated or satisfied or even sad, but I just felt numb, felt emptied out, felt like I'd aged a decade in a week. Marcus didn't speak for a long time, just stared at the television screen showing his parents' mugshots, and finally he said in a voice that sounded much younger than 16, "Nana, did my dad really try to burn down your restaurant? Could he really do something like that?" And I had to tell him yes, had to watch my grandson process the fact that his father had crossed from greed into actual violence, had to hold him while he cried for the father he'd thought he knew, the father who apparently didn't exist, had only ever been a performance hiding someone capable of burning down his own mother's life's work. "I'm sorry," I told Marcus. "Sorry you have to know this about your parents. Sorry you're losing them because of choices they made. Sorry that doing the right thing costs you so much. But I'm also grateful, so grateful you had the courage to warn me, to testify, to choose what's right over what's easy, because Marcus, you saved everything. You saved my businesses and my life, and maybe even your parents from doing something worse, because if that fire had spread, if people had been hurt, they'd be facing much more than arson charges." The fire damage at Eleanor's table took 3 weeks to repair, 3 weeks during which my staff worked around the clock to clean and restore and rebuild, 3 weeks during which the community rallied in a way that humbled me. Customers sending flowers and cards and donations, neighboring businesses offering help, complete strangers showing up with cleaning supplies and volunteer labor. And I realized that 42 years of treating people right, of serving good food and creating jobs and being part of the neighborhood had built something more valuable than real estate, had built goodwill and community and the kind of reputation that made people want to help when things went wrong. We reopened Eleanor's table on a Saturday evening with a celebration that filled every seat, and I stood in the dining room I'd built and rebuilt and almost lost, surrounded by staff who'd become family and customers who'd stayed loyal, and Marcus who'd saved everything. And I made a speech that I hadn't prepared, but that came from somewhere deep and honest. I want to thank everyone who stood by me during the hardest month of my life, everyone who believed in me when my own children didn't, everyone who helped rebuild what someone tried to burn down. This restaurant isn't just a business to me. It's proof that good work and honest dealing and treating people with respect actually matters. It's proof that you can start with nothing and build something that lasts. And it's proof that family isn't always blood. Sometimes family is the people who show up when blood lets you down. If this story has touched you, if you've experienced anything similar, or if you believe in fighting for what you've earned, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel because the story isn't over yet, and I want you here for what comes next. The criminal trial for Robert and Patricia took 8 months to wind through the legal system, 8 months during which they tried every legal maneuver to avoid responsibility, claiming they were framed, claiming the evidence was fabricated, claiming I'd orchestrated everything to destroy them. But the evidence was overwhelming. The accelerant residue, the security footage, the text messages planning the fire, the financial records showing Robert's desperate debt situation, everything pointed to exactly what had happened. My children had tried to burn down what they couldn't steal. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: arson, conspiracy, attempted insurance fraud, because apparently they'd also planned to claim the fire was accidental and force me to rebuild with insurance money they'd somehow try to access. And I sat in the courtroom gallery next to James and Marcus and watched the verdict read, watched my children's faces as they realized they were going to prison, and I still didn't feel what I thought I should feel. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a profound sadness for the people they could have been if greed hadn't poisoned everything. The sentencing hearing was worse than the trial, because that's when I had to speak, when the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, and I stood up in front of my children who wouldn't look at me and said what needed saying. Your Honor, Robert and Patricia are my children. I raised them, I loved them. I gave them everything I had, worked myself to exhaustion to give them opportunities I never had, paid for their education, helped them through difficulties, lent them money I never expected to see returned. And in exchange, they tried to steal from me, tried to have me declared incompetent, broke into my home, and finally tried to burn down my business. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because I want the court to understand that what they did wasn't just arson. It was betrayal of the deepest kind. It was a daughter and son deciding their inheritance was more important than their mother's autonomy, dignity, and safety. I'm 68 years old now, and I'll probably spend whatever years I have left wondering where I failed as a mother, wondering what I could have done differently. But I also know that at some point, people make their own choices, and my children chose greed over love, chose crime over family, chose destruction over patience. I don't ask for leniency, Your Honor. I ask for justice, because if there are no consequences for what they did, then they'll never understand that people aren't just resources to exploit, that mothers aren't just assets to liquidate, that family means something beyond financial transactions. Robert got 7 years, Patricia got 5 as an accessory, and when the bailiffs led them away, Patricia finally looked at me, and in her eyes I saw something that might have been regret or might have been hatred. I couldn't tell anymore, couldn't read my own daughter's face because she'd become a stranger wearing familiar features. Marcus sat beside me and squeezed my hand and whispered, "You did the right thing, Nana. Letting them go to prison is protecting them from themselves, protecting them from doing something even worse next time." And I thought about how wise this 16-year-old had become, how suffering had matured him in ways that should have taken decades, how he understood things about justice and consequences that his parents had never learned. 6 months after the sentencing, after Robert and Patricia had begun serving their time, after the media attention had faded and life had returned to something approaching normal, I made the decisions I'd been planning before any of this chaos had erupted. I restructured all 6 restaurants under an employee ownership trust, giving equity shares to long-term staff, creating a board of directors chosen from management rather than family, establishing a succession plan that would keep Eleanor's Table and all its sister locations operating long after I was gone, operating under the principles I'd built them on: good food, fair treatment, community investment, everything that had made them successful for over 4 decades. I kept majority control during my lifetime, but with clear transition plans, clear governance, clear protection against anyone ever trying to take what these employees had helped build. At the announcement meeting with all senior staff across all locations, Maria stood up with tears streaming down her face and said, "Miss Eleanor, some of us came to you with nothing, with criminal records or immigration problems or no education, and you gave us not just jobs but careers, not just paychecks but dignity. And now you're giving us ownership of something we helped create, and I just want you to know that we'll protect this legacy the same way you protected us, with everything we have." Marcus graduated high school that spring with honors, gave a valedictorian speech about integrity and standing up for what's right even when it costs you everything, never mentioning the family drama directly, but everyone in that auditorium knew what he was talking about, knew that this young man had testified against his own father, had chosen his grandmother over his parents, had paid the price of broken family bonds because some things were more important than peace, and I sat in the audience, wearing my grandmother's pearls, and cried with pride for this boy who'd saved me, who'd become the kind of man his father should have been. He started college in the fall, studying business management and hospitality, planning to eventually join the restaurant group, not because of family obligation, but because he genuinely loved the work, loved the business, loved the idea of creating something that fed people and employed people and mattered to a community. And I thought about succession and legacy and realized that maybe I hadn't failed as a mother, maybe I'd succeeded as a grandmother, maybe the generational cycle had skipped and reset. Maybe Marcus would be the one to carry forward what I'd built. 2 years after the fire, after the trials, after the restructuring, I received a letter from Patricia, forwarded through her prison counselor, asking if I'd be willing to visit, saying she had things she needed to say, things she'd realized during her time inside, and I almost threw the letter away, almost decided that some doors should stay closed. But Marcus encouraged me to go, said maybe she'd finally understand what she'd done, said maybe I'd get closure I didn't know I needed. So I drove to the women's correctional facility on a gray Tuesday morning and sat across from my daughter in a visiting room that smelled like industrial cleaner and disappointment. Patricia looked older than she should, only 46, but looking 60. And when she saw me, she started crying immediately. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen before, but something that looked genuine, looked broken, looked like someone who'd finally hit bottom hard enough to shatter the delusions she'd been living under. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked on that word. "I'm so sorry. I know saying it doesn't change anything, doesn't fix what we did, doesn't give you back what we took, but I need you to hear it. I need you to know that I understand now. I understand that we didn't just try to steal your businesses. We tried to steal your humanity. We tried to reduce you to a resource. We treated you like an obstacle instead of our mother. And I don't know how we became people capable of that. I don't know when. We stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as a bank account. But somewhere along the way, we did. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And I understand if you can't forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me. But I needed you to know that I know what we did was evil, was unforgivable, was the worst kind of betrayal. I listened to my daughter confess and apologize and break down, and I felt something in my chest that had been frozen since that Sunday dinner 2 years ago start to crack. Not forgiveness exactly, not reconciliation, but maybe the beginning of understanding that people can change, that consequences can teach lessons, that sometimes losing everything is what it takes to see clearly what you had and destroyed. I don't forgive you, I told her honestly, because I don't think I can. What you and Robert did broke something that can't be repaired, broke trust and love and the fundamental bond between mother and child, and I'll carry that brokenness for the rest of my life. But Patricia, I do hear your apology. I do believe you understand now. And I hope you use the rest of your time here to become someone different, someone who sees people as people, not as resources, someone who understands that family means protecting each other, not exploiting each other. I'm not going to visit again. I'm not going to write letters. I'm not going to pretend we can rebuild what you burned down. But I want you to know that Marcus is thriving. He's in college. He's working with the restaurants. He's becoming someone remarkable. And when you get out, you'll have a grandson who might be willing to know you if you prove you've really changed. But that's between you and him, not between you and me, because my relationship with you ended the night you tried to burn down. My life's work. Patricia nodded, accepting this, accepting that some consequences are permanent, some betrayals don't get forgiven, some relationships don't survive what hers had put ours through, and I left that prison knowing I'd probably never see my daughter again outside of chance encounters after her release, knowing that I'd effectively lost both my children even though they were alive, knowing that this was the price of protecting myself, of refusing to be a victim, of drawing boundaries that couldn't be crossed without permanent consequences. It hurt. It would always hurt. But it hurt less than surrendering would have. Hurt less than letting them take what I'd built. Hurt less than teaching Marcus that bullies win if you don't fight back. And I drove away from that correctional facility feeling something that might have been closure or might have been acceptance, or might just have been the understanding that you can mourn what you've lost while still celebrating that you survived. 3 years after the Sunday dinner that started everything, Eleanor's Table celebrated its 45th anniversary, and all 6 locations threw synchronized parties, staff and customers and community members filling every restaurant. And I moved between locations throughout the evening, seeing the life and energy and success of businesses that had almost been destroyed, seeing employees who now owned equity celebrating not just my success, but their own, seeing Marcus working the floor at the original location with the same attention to detail and customer care I'd built the empire on. And I thought about my grandmother, about the woman whose pearls I still wore, whose recipes still anchored every menu, whose strength had given me strength. And I imagined her looking down at this moment, at me at 69 years old, still running my empire, still proving everyone wrong who'd ever doubted me, still standing after a war that should have destroyed me. And I imagined her nodding with satisfaction, saying what she'd always said, "Baby girl, they can't take what you won't give them. And you never gave them a damn thing except what they earned." The media still occasionally calls about the story, reporters wanting updates, asking if I've reconciled with my children who are still in prison, asking how it feels to have sacrificed family for business, and I always correct them on that last question because I didn't sacrifice family for business. My children sacrificed family for greed. They made the choice to value money over love. They decided to steal rather than build. They chose destruction over patience, and I simply refused to be their victim, refused to hand over my autonomy and my life's work to people who'd shown they didn't deserve it. The real story isn't that I fought my children. The real story is that I won, that the legal system worked, that elder abuse was recognized and punished, that a 67-year-old woman stood up against people who thought she was weak and proved she was stronger than anyone had imagined. And maybe that's the story that matters. Maybe that's what people need to hear, that you're never too old to fight for what's yours, never too tired to protect what you've built, never too outnumbered to stand your ground when standing ground is what justice requires. Marcus is 20 now, halfway through college, working part-time in the restaurant group, learning every position from dishwasher to floor manager, learning the business the way I learned it, from the ground up with no shortcuts, and sometimes late at night, when we're closing the original Eleanor's Table together, just the two of us in the restaurant where this all started, he asks me if I regret how things turned out, if I wish I'd handled it differently, if I miss his parents despite everything, and I tell him the truth. I regret that my children became people who could do what they did. I wish they'd been different people. I miss the children they were before greed poisoned them. But I don't regret protecting myself, don't regret fighting back, don't regret any single decision I made once they declared war on me, because the alternative was surrender, was letting them steal everything, was teaching you that wrong actions don't have consequences, and that would have been the real tragedy. Not that a family broke apart, but that you learned nothing good comes from standing up to bullies. Last month I turned 70. And my staff threw me a surprise party at Eleanor's Table, 300 people crammed into a restaurant that technically holds 180, everyone I'd worked with over 45 years, everyone whose life I'd touched, everyone who'd helped build this empire, and they presented me with a plaque that read, Eleanor Washington, builder, fighter, survivor, inspiration, thank you for showing us what strength looks like. And I stood there with my grandson beside me, with my chosen family surrounding me, with my grandmother's pearls around my neck, and my businesses thriving, and my autonomy intact and my dignity preserved. And I thought about that Sunday dinner 3 years ago, thought about my children dividing up apartments they didn't own, planning a future based on stealing what I'd built, threatening me with guardianship and commitment and courts, and I thought about how they'd underestimated me so completely, so catastrophically, so definitively, that they'd ended up in prison while I ended up here, celebrating 7 decades of life and 45 years of business and 3 years of survival. And I realized something important, something that felt like wisdom earned through fire and litigation and betrayal, which is that the family that dismisses your strength is the same family that will try to exploit your perceived weakness. And the moment you prove you're not weak, the moment you show them you'll fight with everything you have, that's when you discover who really loves you and who just loves what you can give them. My children chose greed. Marcus chose love. My staff chose loyalty. I chose survival. And 3 years later, I'm still standing, still running my empire, still proving that you're never too old to fight, never too tired to protect what's yours, never too outnumbered to win when you're fighting for what's right. And if there's a moral to this story, if there's something I want people to take away from this nightmare that became a victory, it's this: boundaries aren't cruel, they're necessary. Protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no to people who demand you sacrifice yourself for their benefit, even when those people are your own children, especially when those people are your own children, because love without respect isn't love at all. It's just exploitation wearing a familiar face. I own my restaurants, all 6 of them, and they're thriving under employee ownership structures that will protect them long after I'm gone. I have a grandson who understands integrity and justice and what it costs to do the right thing. I have staff who've become family in ways my blood family never was. I have my autonomy, my dignity, my businesses, my life, everything my children tried to take, still mine, still protected, still sacred, because I refused to surrender even when surrender seemed easier. They hosted one Sunday dinner in my building and thought that entitled them to floors and parking spaces and equity they never earned. But buildings don't work that way, empires don't work that way, life doesn't work that way, and the moment they learned that lesson was the moment they lost everything, and I kept everything, and 3 years later I'm still here, still strong, still standing, still Eleanor Washington, and no Sunday dinner will ever change that. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've felt the anger and betrayal and ultimate triumph of fighting back against people who underestimate you, I hope you'll leave a comment, sharing your own experience or thoughts, and I hope you'll share this video with anyone who needs to hear that it's never too late to protect yourself, never too wrong to say no, never too hard to fight back when fighting back is what survival demands, because your story matters, my story matters, and together, maybe we can change the narrative about what elder abuse looks like and why it's so important to stand against it, always, without compromise, without surrender, without ever backing down. I changed the locks at midnight 3 years ago, and I've never looked back. My empire stands. My boundaries hold. My life is mine. And that is how you win when everyone expects you to lose. Not by being cruel, but by being strong. Not by attacking, but by defending what's yours. Not by destroying others, but by refusing to let others destroy you. Strength, boundaries, survival. That's the Eleanor Washington way. And after 70 years on this earth, and 45 years building an empire, and 3 years fighting the hardest battle of my life, I'm still here, still standing, still proving that you can't take what someone won't give you. And I never gave them a damn thing except what they earned, which was consequences, justice, and the permanent knowledge that their mother was stronger than they ever imagined.